Great. Welcome back, everybody. And I'm seeing folks are piling into the room here. So we will get started in just a moment or two. Housekeeping as before. I just want to encourage folks to use the chat box for questions. Use it throughout. People, the other participants really enjoy seeing what folks are thinking and what questions are being asked. Makes for other questions. Our speakers, so that they can pay attention to the conversation. We have backup staff who are just monitoring comments, so everyone can read them, but our staff will help elevate questions and make sure that you get to engage in that discussion. I really appreciate everybody coming back, and I'm going to go ahead and we'll wait till these slides are through, but I'll come on briefly. But I hope folks got a chance to step outside, get some sunlight. That was a really, really tough but really valuable discussion that we had with Daniel Enemark. And I think, really I'm proud of the work and being able to sponsor that here at the San Diego Housing Federation. I'm going to go ahead and with that, just welcome everybody back to the program. I know people are still coming in, and just remind you that the links you used for the morning and for the afternoon are going to be good again tomorrow for the morning and the afternoon, same way. But that allows us to kind of clear the room and set up the slideshow and do all those kinds of things. So appreciate your working with us on that. I won't say much more because this is not about me. This is really about our guests here today. And so I just want to welcome the moderator for this next discussion, Josh Butler, who is the Executive Director of the Lanterman Housing Alliance. Josh is a recent friend, I would say, but a great colleague. And I will hand it off to Josh to introduce this remarkable panel. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Josh, for leading this discussion.
Thank you, Steve, so much, and thank you for having me here today, and thank you for inviting the Lanterman Housing Alliance to participate in this today. My name is Josh Butler. I'm the Executive Director of the Lanterman Housing Alliance, and I'm really honored to be here this morning to present this panel to you and moderate this morning. We have some great panelists here today. Just a quick about the Lanterman Housing Alliance. We are a membership organization. We work with affordable housing developers, regional centers, nonprofits, and our goal is to build affordable housing or advocate to get affordable housing built for the intellectual and developmental disability community. So to that end, we meet on a regular basis. We've developed a statewide strategic framework, and we're trying to advance our cause through the state legislature, also administratively as well. And so when I got the call to see if I was interested in putting a panel together, I said, of course, that I was honored and be happy to. And it had been on the heels of some recent activity up in Sacramento from TCAC, the Tax Credit Allocation Committee, and they had proposed to reduce accessibility requirements. And once the word got around, thanks to Disability Rights California, word got around that this was happening, and the disabilities community responded quite vociferously in over 3 hours of testimony. That afternoon, TCAC responded by reversing course and not proposing reductions. They had proposed reducing accessibility requirements down from 10% down to 5%. By that afternoon, they were proposing to increase accessibility requirements from 10% up to 15%. And so they saw there was a need, but this came from somewhere. The conversation started somewhere. And so I thought, in talking to folks, that maybe it's a good idea to just go back to basics and do a little 101 and talk about why we do what we do. And so to that end, I was able to put together our panel today. One moment here while I try to get fancy and share my screen. Jeez. Can't get rid of this top thing. Well, I'm just going to introduce our panel as such and stop sharing the screen. So we have a wonderful panel for you here today, and I'm honored. I know these folks well. Some of them I know better than others. Our first speaker is going to be Jessica Gould. Jessica is a disabled female with quadriplegic cerebral palsy and a seizure disorder. She's an independent legislative consultant with her own firm, J. Gould Consulting, which was opened in 2019 with the initial goal of educating service providers of the regional center system on how the regional centers and other systems impact their businesses through the legislative process. Since the opening, the goals and aspirations have expanded to broadening advocacy efforts and awareness for people with disabilities through the legislative process. Jessica believes in equal opportunity for people regardless of disability, limitation or otherwise, and she has held several volunteer positions with regional centers. Hold on a second. And I'm honored to be able to work with her today, as part of our alliance. Hold on a second. Okay. Our next speaker is someone that I know even better than our first. I met Jessica last year. Our next speaker I met, well, in my life, some 46 years ago. And that would be my brother, Branden. Branden is someone that I've had an opportunity to work with in the past, and we were both working at independent living centers. I know you all know him well, quite well indeed, as he was integral in starting this. Now he is the Assistant Deputy Director of Education and Outreach for the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing. Prior to joining DEFH in 2019, he was the Senior Attorney of Fair Housing Center of the Legal Aid Society in San Diego, where for 9 years he was instrumental in creating the fair housing services and programs there that provide education, outreach, testing, and enforcement for housing. He has litigated fair housing cases on a broad range of issues, including a successful jury trial, verdict in a sexual harassment case, obtained settlements and injunctive relief, measures including the creation of accessible apartments, units in a disability housing discrimination case, successfully challenged discriminatory housing occupancy policies against families with children, and obtained voluntary compliance agreements with the Department of Urban and Housing Development. I'm super proud of my brother, and I'm super honored that I might be able to be on this panel with him today. I hope my mom is snooping somewhere around, able to at least listen in. And then our last speaker, let me go through all my notes here. Our last speaker is Erin Montgomery. Erin is a member, is part of the Chelsea Investment Fund and a member of the Lanterman Housing Alliance. She has over 15 years of experience in affordable housing development, including project management, development, finance consulting, and investor analysis. She has worked on affordable housing developments, finance with programs including federal and state low-income housing tax credits, tax-exempt bonds, historic tax credits. To make a long story short, Erin speaks your language, and that's why I invited her to be part of this panel today. My goal here is to talk to you about the problem and the root of the problem, and that's Jessica's going to play, and talk about her experiences from the micro level. My brother's going to come in a little bit more from the macro level and talk about things from there. And then Erin's going to come in and be a little more solutions oriented and speak your language and talk about how she does what she does, and ultimately, I think you'll see by the end of this all how important all of this is as we all work together to try and create more affordable, accessible housing opportunities. And so with that, I'm going to pass it off over to our first panelist, and that is Jessica Gould. Jessica, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Josh. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm here to give you guys a little bit of what I call the realistic end of the housing and affordability crisis. I am fortunate enough now to live in a low-income building in Panorama City that is HUD. regulated, which means it is completely met with my needs structurally and financially. However, it took me 8 years to get here. And prior to that, I moved over 15 times. Each location, even though I had at points means to modify the property to my needs, this could have meant putting in a simple ramp. It was up to the landlords to allow me to do that, and every single one said no. So as a result, when landlords and property owners have the ability to tell a person who needs the physical accommodation on top of rent issues, the person ends up losing things like deposits and paying for damages that quite honestly aren't their fault. So it kind of just snowballs into a huge problem. And then I'm in Los Angeles, so not all counties work with housing organizations. So you're left with one option, which is to deal with the state and federal level, and waiting for years for an apartment complex, and trying to struggle and figure it out in between. And it can get quite difficult because there's not really a lot of people that understand why these modifications need to be met and need to be made regardless. Some of them are simple, like a wider doorway. Others are more complex, like a large flat bathroom that won't flood when you turn on the water and flood into your living room and cause all sorts of damage. So that's my overall experience with the housing and the issues that are being addressed today. There is simply a lack of accommodation understanding, and of course affordability is a major issue on several levels. So if you combine those two things, then it leads to a snowball effect of people just waiting on minimal lists. If housing developers and people who develop housing for individuals with disabilities don't get involved, there's just simply not enough. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. And as you hear, you know that the challenge at the individual level can be so difficult, and that's just one example. And that's there's so many examples that I've heard of throughout my career, and I've been doing this for about 20 years myself. I have served on the board of directors for the Fair Housing Foundation up here in Long Beach, and I've served on the Citizens Advisory Commission on Disabilities here in the city of Long Beach. And so I know that reasonable accommodation complaints and requests are so common. They were the #1 complaint when I was at FHF. And I think you'll hear from our next speaker that they are still coming up quite high. And so one of the things that we hope to try and bring up here is that, or that I want to highlight, is not only are you hearing about these particular cases or these complaints that you'll hear about, but we also have the hidden complaints, the ones we don't hear about, the folks that don't make the phone call, the folks that don't know about the resources, or don't even get up off the ground to fight the fight. Jessica fought the fight and she got to where she is. What we ultimately want to do is make it so that folks don't have to fight a fight to get to where they need to be. And so somebody who's helping us do that at the state level, and who's done that a lot down there in San Diego, is now doing it at the state level, is Branden Butler. And so Branden, I'm going to hand it off to you. This is the first time he and I have been in any kind of work Zoom environment. We worked together many years ago when we were both in independent living centers. So it's an honor to be working with him again today, and I'm very proud of you. With that, I hand it off to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. You're too kind. I'm proud of all your work and being a fellow housing warrior. And thank you to SDRAFFH and to San Diego Housing Federation and to all my friends in San Diego. It's a pleasure to be here with you today for yet another wonderful fair housing conference. So hats off to everyone for making this happen. It's really important that we commemorate Fair Housing Month, because as you've heard from Jessica's moving presentation and Josh's comments, we have a lot of work to do. And I'm going to outline a little bit of where we are in kind of the struggle for civil rights around for folks with disabilities and housing, and talk a little bit about some of the data we have to kind of highlight the extent of the problem, and and kind of give some insight. So with that, I'm going to do my Zoom DJing here. I feel like in this pandemic, I've become a proficient DJ of screen sharing. So let me go ahead and do that. And let me go right here. All right, so pleasure to be here. And so let's get into it. So as you've heard, yes, I'm the Assistant Deputy of Education Outreach at DFEH. Got to give you the disclaimer, of course, right? This is just for education purposes, does not constitute legal advice. And most folks probably here today are aware of who we are at the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. But believe it or not, because of our name, because of the history, many folks do not know. So I always like to start by saying we are California Civil Rights Agency. And it's our mission is to protect the people of California from unlawful discrimination in employment, businesses. We're talking about housing, human trafficking, and obviously acts of hate violence. And let me say that we at DFEH certainly stand united against the horrible acts of bias-motivated violence that we've been seeing throughout California on the basis of API identity. So we stand united against the anti-Asian hatred that has been occurring in our state, and I know we all do, but it's important to remind folks. So, and we also have jurisdiction there as well. But moving through, because we got a lot to cover, I wanted to start this conversation by just kind of taking a quick moment back to say, this is the 53rd year after the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act, and certainly the issues that you heard in your earlier session today are even more exacerbated as we stand here 53 years later. We have a lot of work to do. And when I think about the Federal Fair Housing Act, I'm always reminded that of the struggle, and you see from the pictures below you of California Governor Pat Brown signing the 1963 Rumford Fair Housing Act. You can see Byron Rumford, the legislator behind him. And it's an important story because we had a Fair Housing Act in California prior to the Federal Act. Of course, it was repealed by a popular vote of 2-to-1 margin to allow private discrimination in housing. Luckily, it was reversed by the Supreme Court, but just as a reminder of the struggle of fair housing that we have here today, that we had 53 years ago and beyond, and it stays with us today, which is why it's so important to come together and talk about solutions and recognize the existing problems. So as we build into our discussion on disability numbers, I think it's important to understand, well, if disability is a large problem, it's important to look at how many protected bases that we have under our fair housing laws and the laws we enforce. So in California, we have a host of protected bases, which is something we're all very proud of. But I just am showing you these slides because I want to work into disability. And you see all the protected bases. Out of all of these protected bases, every year in the state of California, the highest number of complaints that we receive at the Department of Fair Employment and Housing is for disability-based housing discrimination. This is the data for 2019. We're going to be releasing 2020 soon. So this is the latest data. And I actually went back and looked at, every year for the last 10 years. And every year it's disability-based housing discrimination. And as I always think about it, the reason that is because I believe that there's a lot of disability-based housing discrimination. And it's partly because of the issues that Jessica lined up, of the need for accessibility, the need for accommodation, folks not understanding the civil rights of persons with disabilities, and the only place to go is to file a fair housing complaint to try to get a remedy. So in 2019, we had 934 complaints filed with the department. And folks can allege, a complainant can allege more than one basis, right? So you could say it was disability-based discrimination and race, which is why the number 1,556 is above. But you see here that disability is the highest that we had in 2019. And to break it down in a pie chart of the basis of complaints, disability represents that big chunk of 35% of what we see, by far and away the highest level of discrimination. And these are the kind of whole potpourri of cases. It could be the denial of an accommodation, which we'll talk about later. It could be outright discrimination on the basis of a disability, which certainly is an issue. But it can be a whole kind of, several issues wrapped up within that. But you see right here, we have disability is the highest, representing 35%. And that number breakdown is that of those, of the 1,500 bases, we have 538 disability complaints. But then you can break out on the third row here, those are just about folks who made a complaint related to an accommodation. We're going to talk about what an accommodation is more broadly, but it's the idea that someone with a disability can request a change to a rule, policy, or practice or service that is necessary to afford them equal use and enjoyment of the property. So we have those as kind of a subset of disability-based discrimination. But again, as I point out, whether you go back 10 years, you go back, 2019, folks with disabilities have faced a high level of discrimination. And of course, the Federal Fair Housing Act amended, allowed protections for persons with disabilities in 1988, but still the civil rights of persons with disabilities is the highest complaint that we receive. It's the most investigated and enforced case that we do. And again, just showing you that number in comparison to some of the other protected bases. But to kind of give an overview of, well, we understand those are the complaints, but like, what's the law at issue generally that we're enforcing? And usually the issue is what I talked about is this reasonable accommodation, the idea that this is a change to rule, policy, or practice or service that's necessary for someone's disability. And this could be things from, I need to move down to a first floor apartment because I have a disability, I'm no longer able to get down the stairs. There has to be this idea of a logical and necessary connection between what you need and the disability. And there's so many types of accommodations. I mean, whether it's, communicating with a third party because someone has an intellectual disability and they prefer to go through their caseworker. We could go on and on, whether it's a modification of having to get a modified unit due to someone's disability. These are where the range of the cases come from. So the first, I think, kind of idea is because we don't have accessible, properties generally, there's a great need for reasonable accommodations, and therefore, because they're case by case, it becomes disputes. And our regulations, which were introduced in 2020, is the first fair housing regulations that I'm aware of at a state level, and that's where I'm reading from here from section 12176. But this is where you'll find the law and some substance of what is it, and this just gives you a little bit more about what the accommodation is. But remember, accommodations can be made at any time, even through an eviction. And with limited exceptions, all information concerning the individual's disability accommodation request and medical verification must be kept confidential. So this is where someone with a disability is engaging with the housing provider to request a change to a service or practice. And there are contours to what can be asked for, and the information has to be kept confidential. And you can see why disputes can arise because there is this engagement and that occurs. Modification is the kind of sister to accommodation. This is a physical change to the structure or building. So as Jessica was pointing out, properties that were made before the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1988, had very low level of accessibility. And even properties today under California building laws are just kind of a baseline level of accessibility. They're not truly designed for persons with physical disabilities. But therefore, there becomes this need for reasonable modifications. We'll have to change up the property, put in a ramp, widening doorways, and I certainly know, my colleagues at Legal Aid who are listening from our past cases. These were, a steady stream of the cases, and often, heartbreaking cases of people who may not be able to live independently unless they get this modification, unless they get the ramp, they can't make it in, they're crawling. If they can't widen the doorway, they may have to go to a nursing home. So these are very significant, challenging issues and needs that arise in the disability context. And just remember as well that when folks are asking for accommodations, the law envisions an interactive process where the tenant and the housing provider are trying to come together to ensure that the requested accommodation can be granted perhaps immediately. Of course, there can be some ways where an accommodation can be rejected, and our regulations kind of go through that. But the idea of the interactive process is we're trying to come together and solve it. Can the housing provider immediately grant the accommodation? If they cannot, then we have to talk about the reasons why, and we have to also consider whether there's an equally effective alternative. But remember, a person with a disability has no obligation to accept an alternative if it's not meeting their needs. And remember, the accommodation requests are often necessary. As Jessica was pointing out, for many folks with a disability, that necessity will be kind of on its face of needing an accessible unit due to a physical disability, which is readily apparent. So in cases like that, a housing provider really can't ask for any additional information where the need and the disability are readily apparent to know. And I think an important point that our regulations bring home is that remember that when we're talking about accommodations and certifying them and kind of this dance that is required to afford someone the accommodation, the information doesn't always have to come from the quote unquote medical professional. Often persons with disabilities, are able to just self-certify the disability. But information from a reliable third party who's in a position to know about the disability or the disability-related need can also verify the need for this accommodation that the housing provider is trying to put forth. And so I think, I would say that, here's a case that we did right before the pandemic started at DFEH. But I think it kind of brings home the need of these are the kind of cases that we see. And a lot of this is based on a lack of accessible housing. And so there's these constant accommodation issues that arise. And here's a case that was done up in the Bay Area with basically a complainant who relies solely on a wheelchair for mobility, filed a complaint with the DFEH because they failed to accommodate the tenant when she requested to move to a first floor unit because the elevator in the complex had become inoperable and essentially was trapped and lost her independence. And even though there were available first floor units, her request was delayed for more than a year, that she was essentially held captive. And this is a case that brings home again the need of accessible housing, the need to reasonably accommodate people because the housing is not accessible. Luckily, this did come to a resolution, but it's just, as Josh pointed out, not every case is going to get to us. Not every case is going to get to a fair housing center. A lot of cases will not arise, but this is the constant struggle that persons with disabilities have been facing in this area because of the lack of accessible housing. These issues arise. So with that, I also just want to let folks know before I turn it over back to Josh is that we do have a lot of resources for housing providers, for tenants, for everyone. I first want to let you know that we've launched the Keep California Fair campaign. You may see radio advertisements and billboards talking about California civil rights and really trying to keep California fair for everyone. So check that out if you see it. I saw it at a 7-Eleven the other day, so that was exciting. And we also have various resources on source of income discrimination, also new materials on criminal history and housing, and so on and so forth. You can find all of our housing materials at dfeh.ca. So thank you again. It's always a pleasure. Thank you, SDRAFFH, Standing Housing Federation. Appreciate it. Thank you, Josh. Pleasure to do this with you, a first in the Butler household. Take care.
No, indeed. Thank you. And I've already sent the screenshot around to all the family. So thank you, Branden. As you hear, that the disability complaints, reasonable accommodation complaints remain at the top. This has not changed since my time at Fair Housing Foundation. And so that's very challenging. Enforcement's very challenging. And so that kind of leads us to our next speaker, Erin Montgomery, who is a developer, builds affordable, accessible housing for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And all this leads to, why it's so important to make sure that we are able to create affordable, accessible opportunities at the front end, at the beginning, so that people we work with the segment of folks who don't even know if they want to live independently or not, because the opportunities haven't really existed for them to even ponder that. So when we get to that point, then we have to get to, are there even units? So the more accessible units we can create, the more affordable accessible units create, the more opportunities that individuals with IDD have to actually realize their goal of living independently. For everybody, living at home with a family member is not living independently, especially when they reach adulthood. So this is something that we have to address. Thankfully, we have folks like the Chelsea Investment Corporation who are addressing this on a regular basis. And so with that, I want to hand it over to Erin Montgomery, and thank you very much for taking the time to be with us here this morning. Erin, thank you.
Thanks for having me. So I am Erin Autry Montgomery. I work with Chelsea Investment Corporation. I've been doing housing finance, project management for, I guess, maybe 17 years now. I guess I should update that bio. I've worked in the greater San Diego area for a long time. I've also worked all over the state of California, different states, Texas, Arkansas, New Mexico, Wyoming, Utah, Arizona, Idaho, name it. I might have done the deal there. So I do say I like to do deals in California. I'm from California, I live here. So this is my favorite state to work in. I love working with Chelsea. They have created over 10,000 homes, $2 billion in total development cost, all over the greater San Diego area, out into the Imperial County, up in LA and Orange County, greater Southern California, and then throughout the Central Valley as well. So they are a very experienced developer, and the struggle to create homes for folks with IDD, intellectual and developmental disabilities, I'll just sort of shorthand that from moving forward, is important to Chelsea as an organization. And to that end, they have made a strong partnership with the San Diego Imperial Regional Center, and they've created, I think, 7 developments now with about 100 units set aside for households with a member that has an IDD. And there's 2 more in pre-development. And those projects are in San Diego. Independence Point has 75% of the units set aside for IDD regional center consumers. These could be children living with parents, minor children, adult children. The situations are fluid, and we try to provide sort of a range of apartment sizes to accommodate folks in the developmental disability set-asides that we create. We also have a few projects out in the Imperial County that we've set aside, and those are amazing opportunities for folks that the Imperial County doesn't often have market rate complexes, let alone affordable complexes, let alone projects with units specifically for regional center consumers. And so those families we're very super grateful. And I think one of the most meaningful things that I have come across in working with Chelsea in pursuing funding to create these units is, at a grand opening at a project in Lakeside, a man cried. He was in a wheelchair. He was provided a unit with a roll-in shower, and he said this is the first time he's been able to bathe himself as an adult. And that's a meaningful thing. People need to be able to live independently, and to be provided with units that allow them to do that is important to Chelsea. I think Jim Schmid, the president and CEO, said it best. He said, imagine for a moment you're a parent or a family member of a person with a developmental disability. Your single biggest fear is, where will my child, brother, sister live when I'm gone? We create places where individuals can live independently in homes that are designed to meet their unique circumstances. So that, and we do, we do make the units that we're setting aside, have roll-in showers, have all of the ADA and universal design characteristics that are required for independent living. We don't want to create too many that doesn't meet the population that we have intended to serve. There's a balance for developers. in creating projects that meet the market. And certainly there is an affordability crisis in the state of California, so almost any affordable unit has takers for it in any community in the state. And there are many developmental disability folks that are in that affordable population that are seeking these apartments. That said, we have a strong partnership with the San Diego Regional Center and DDS, and they are not huge fans of doing more than 25% set aside in any given project. They will go up for certain circumstances, but they would prefer to keep it at 25% or less. And so we have projects, with 10 units set aside, 12 units, 15. Those are sort of the standard sizes, and generally affordable apartment complexes range between 60 and 100 units. So that's where we land in creating a mixed population development. And Josh asked me to say, how do we do what we do? And I've heard people say, well, just give it to Erin. She'll put the magic sauce together and create some sort of magical pro forma. And there's no magic in the pro forma. Developers chase financing. And if there's funding for projects with special needs, then we chase those as well. And Chelsea prefers to, they don't prefer, Chelsea likes to partner with the regional center to create units in specific projects. We have 50 units coming up at a project in Claremont. It's over 400 units that's being entitled and that will be set aside for folks with developmental disabilities. And that was in part because we were chasing an RFP, and an RFP asked, would you set aside any units for special needs? And we took a look at it. We talked to the regional center, we talked to other partners, and we decided the best mix of population would be some for seniors, some for families, and to mix in a portion of disabled apartments for folks with IDD. So that great relationship really is key to creating the units, and then we go chase the funding. And what is the funding out there right now to create these units? And in the past, we've used MHP Supportive, and they've sort of transitioned that program just to be MHP General with a supportive set aside, so we can kind of go after those funds, but with those funds come strings like state prevailing wage, and so those can become more expensive. And so it's a balance of what funding sources are out there and how expensive are the projects to do, and do they need more than one financing source. We have received money from DDS through their community redevelopment, CRDC is the acronym, funding, which used to be called CPP, Community Placement Program. And that is specifically to create units that are for people to live independently, to not be going to developmental regional centers. We have used local funds from the San Diego County Innovative Housing Trust Fund to create these units. And then finally, those are all funding sources that allow us to set aside units at certain income levels, allow us to do the roll-in showers and any other improvements to the units that would be perhaps prohibitively expensive without the special funding. We've also reached out and received funds from nonprofit foundations for these units. In a case where we didn't have any other funding set aside to create these units, the nonprofit foundation reached out and said, could you create a set aside of 7 to 8 units in this particular project in Southern San Diego? And we said, yes, we would, and they said, do we have this money? It's special for this. Could you give us 10 units? And we said, okay, that we could do that. And we'd target those income levels lower than what we were originally planning on. But even when we do target those income levels lower, so we've got all the funding for the project, we find that, 30% AMI is still kind of a burden for some folks, frankly. It's a lot if you only have SSI of $900 to pay $400 or $500 for an apartment unit in a 1-bedroom. And so we really also try to reach out to local housing authorities, the Imperial Valley Housing Authority, the San Diego Housing Authority, the county, to get vouchers, and through the state, the Section 811 vouchers, because that allows the tenants to really pay the 30% of their income and have the funding for the other important needs in their life. So those sort of that's the magic sauce that we look at. We look at the project, we talk to partners, we look at funding sources, and we look at timelines. And we try to put together what we think would be a meaningful project for the community. We we would like to build more, frankly. You know, we have projects in our pipeline that we, you know, I have, you know, placeholder funding from certain groups saying if we can keep working with them to get this funding, I think it's really an excellent location to move that forward. And then I think we've got 2 or 3 more in the pipeline. We also work with inclusionary housing developments, and they're not unopposed to setting aside some of these units as well. It's just an advocacy effort on behalf of the community that Chelsea undertakes, and it's because of strong partnerships with the San Diego Regional Center and the Southern California Housing Collaborative, which is a nonprofit housing organization that helps provide the services. Speaking of services, the wraparound services that the Regional Center provides for the units that we build for the IDD community is really important to us. As a developer, you know, we build and develop housing. The provision of services is outside of our wheelhouse. And so to be partnered with a strong group that we know the services are going to be there for the tenants is really important to us as a developer. We want to create these mixed population developments. We want to create the right types of units with the right roll and shower for this particular segment, or, you know, wider doorways over here, or, you know, making sure we've matched the population to the unit. That's important to us because we are trying to provide independent living for anyone in our community, but especially those folks that have faced such housing discrimination. I had no idea in the previous slides that the complaints on the disability side were so much higher than all the rest at the fair housing. So that was eye-opening, and I appreciate that. Thank you. And so that was sort of all I had to share from what Josh asked me to share, and I'm happy to take questions. I see one here. AMI is not a great measurement to tie into what's considered affordable because of the large disparity between wealth and poverty in the region. What's considered affordable is still well outside the range of what someone can receive. I agree. I mean, I agree if you're on SSI, that a 30% AMI rent of a 1-bedroom is a lot. It is more than 30% of your income because your SSI is not 30% AMI. Right now, you know, as affordable housing developers that primarily use the low income tax credit, we sort of target our AMI breakdowns to what we need to win points in the funding categories for tax credits. And so typically 30% is where you get the points. And so we target units at 30%. When we have vouchers and we're going after, let's say, MHP funding, I think a 15 or a 20 or a 25%, depending on that population that we're setting the units aside for, is probably important to hit. So with that, I'll turn it back to Josh if there's any other questions you have for the panel. Oh, there's one more.
You've got another question there.
Okay, added cost for making units specifically for the disabled tenant. You know, it's not 25%. No, it's not that much. You know, well, it depends, right? Are we doing like more than a roll-in shower? Is it I have to say it's regional, right? Because construction costs vary by region. So it's going to cost less out in Imperial Valley somewhat than it is in Irvine, where everything is like 400 times more anyway. So I think that's probably sort of a specific question, but there is a cost, and the funding from, let's say, like the nonprofit foundation really does help to bridge that gap.
Erin, I'm going to extrapolate on that question. I think if I get into that a little more deeply, that I think one of the things that we hear out there, and perhaps one of the reasons why there is a shyness to develop accessible housing, is that cost. And what do you think is that, why do you think that is the case, that there is this, that it's such a cost driver? I mean, I think that one of the reasons that TCAC made the proposal was they were looking to expedite the development of housing, and one of the ways they thought to develop would be to reduce the accessibility requirement. So how do we overcome that perception of this cost driver there?
Sure. Well, cost containment in affordable housing is important. And I think probably you're right, TCAC thought that, or may have considered that they don't want to be adding an additional layer to make things more expensive. I mean, it is more expensive to do a unit. I do not think it's 25%. I don't have the numbers in front of me, unfortunately. If it is 25%, it's 25% of one unit, 1 out of, or 1 to 10 out of 60. It's not going to add 25% to the cost of the project in total, right? It maybe it's, $35,000 a unit, just that ballparking number, to do this. And then funding sources, though, do provide additional funds. The MHP loan limit, if you're doing a supportive housing unit, is $25,000 more a unit. So, the funding sources do understand that you would have some extra accessibility features that you would build into the project. And I'm not saying that every unit has to have a roll-in shower. Not everyone has a mobility challenge that would require a roll-in shower. And so, we start to look at the population that might live there and decide. So, if it's a roll-in shower, great. We've got some good plans to do that, and it's easy for us to do since we've already done it. Perhaps it is cost prohibitive to people who don't want to be modifying their unit plans significantly, especially if they're already partway through the permitting process.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Erin. We do have one more question. I'm going to read the question, and then if anybody on my panel wants to take it, go ahead. And many of the clients reach us at TSA San Diego for rental assistance claims that they claim that they are in Section 8 waiting list for 8 years. Some of them are in there for more than that. Is there no other way for this time period of the waiting list to be shorter? Isn't it a long time for someone who's in a financial hardship to wait? Also, some are HUD. When they are faced with issues with the apartment units they're staying in, they are unable to move out, or they will lose their rental assistance. So I think, some of the common problems we do see with this Section 8 voucher. Anybody on the panel want to take that or field that?
I mean, I'll just say, that's like the $64,000 question, right? I mean, the struggle of Section 8 waiting list has been, I know, for over a long time. I mean, I probably, Josh and I remember being, kind of advocating in Los Angeles when folks were waiting for 10 years and losing vouchers for procedural reasons. So, I mean, I think it's a big problem. And I think that goes to this broader conversation of, is Section 8 housing the only way for someone to survive, who may have a disability and be on SSI? And I think, the conversation is there's these other drivers of affordable housing, tax credit housing, because certainly the voucher system is not able to satisfy the huge need for affordable housing. And I think that's why across the country, especially here in California, waiting lists easily can be a decade or longer. And so I sympathize with the plight, but I think that's kind of the essence of, I think, what the Federation does and what so many advocates do here today, which is how do we solve this problem? Because we know folks on SSI aren't able to find affordable housing at all that they can afford, and waiting for 10 years, you may not survive it, right? If you're not able to get housing. So I think that's the idea of how is more housing built? And I think that's the billion-dollar question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the key when we get into this. We get into that supply problem that we have all across the board. If we were to take a look at the pandemic and say we need to try and solve this pandemic, but we don't have enough vaccinations, we'd find it very difficult to get our way out of this. And this is the problem that we've been facing in the affordable housing world for more than 20 years now, is we just don't have enough. And I picked 20 years out of the year because it's when I started doing the work at an independent living center, sharing an office with our housing coordinator, and people coming in and saying, I'm on SSI, I can't find a place to live. And then they have, $700, $800 a month in rent in Long Beach, for, at that time, for a studio apartment would have taken up at least 100% of their income. And that problem's only gotten worse. When we look at solutions, it gets challenging when we don't have, again, that supply chain is so short. We get desperate and we reach out for the solutions, and they end up not being the ultimate solution. They're not designed to be the ultimate solution. Section 8 wasn't designed to be the ultimate solution 50 years later, we're wondering, I wonder if it's even able to, how long we'll be able to carry on for. As housing has gotten expensive, and a renter's market, it works. In a landlord's market, it gets incredibly difficult, as we saw over the last decade. A lot of landlords in Los Angeles County stepping away from the Section 8 program. And then when it does work, I think as this question kind of alludes to, there are times where the area median income doesn't even match up with the cost of housing, and you have housing authorities having to jump through flaming hoops to try and make something work so that somebody can move in. And all around, we've got to make it easier. And so I think, as Erin was, we've got to build more. We've got to increase the supply chain quite significantly. It's a big hurdle, and we've been doing this, you know, it seems like it's gotten better, certainly, than when I started doing this work in 2001. People know there's a crisis. We don't have to remind people. I tell my colleagues, we don't have to remind, we've made enough progress that everybody knows there's a crisis. Now we need to figure out how we get to solutions and know that there is not a silver bullet. And on that, I will say, you know, when we talk about how much time I've been doing this work, 20 years ago, I was approached on the idea of using shipping containers as affordable housing. And I was, you know, appalled at the idea of putting people in shipping containers 20 years ago. Here we are now, and it's become, you know, it's almost a fad to build affordable housing with a shipping container. And so I've learned that we can't say no to options. We can't say no to opportunities. They're not enough. So we have to take everything that we have. And so as you see, you know, Laura kind of, I'm sorry, I see the name on the side. As you see Erin kind of having to pull from all over the place. And it just reminds me of like a mad cook in the kitchen trying to reach into every cabinet and drawer they can to try and make a dish. We've got to figure out how to make that a little bit easier so that more recipients can receive and people don't have to go through the challenges that Jessica faced on her end. And I did see another comment, and I do want to comment on that the 25% being pulled out of the air. And yeah, that is, with your point that you're making there, Alan, I think that's kind of the point that I want to drive home through all of this, that it is easier, it's less costly to be involved at the beginning than it is to come back and do it later. And so that is a big reason why we wanted to do this panel and talk about why we do what we do and why we've all been doing what we've been doing for so long. So I see another comment in the box there. Are there additional questions? And please feel free to keep them coming. Here's the question from Laura. When we talk about fair housing, much of the discussion centers on the aspect of race, which is understandable given the history of racism in housing. Yet, as we saw in Branden's slide, ableism is a major fair housing issue, and other protected classes experience discrimination as well. How can we elevate awareness on these aspects of fair housing to lead to increased action on solutions?
Well, yeah, that's a great question, Laura. I mean, I would agree with you. I mean, on one hand, I would say, you know, certainly race is an issue, and it's an issue that's very hard to detect in housing discrimination, right? So sometimes the level of complaints that come in may not reflect the actual discrimination occurring, right? Because of so many reasons, folks may feel this is a part of life and they're not even going to complain, they're just going to move on because it's so conditioned, racism overtly. So I mean, that's one issue. I think you're right, though, that there is a trend that's been consistent for many years that people with disabilities are filing complaints with the FEH in larger numbers than any other issue. And I think it's, you know, and I think the way we elevate that, you know, again, is through our outreach and training, and we have some new resources coming online. But I think it's a constant, you know, task, because this is the one area of the law where there is some, not want to say technical side, but, you know, when you're engaging in accommodations and changing and retrofitting, the nature of it, if the tenant doesn't obtain the accommodation, is there's a mechanism for a complaint, as opposed to maybe like racial discrimination or something where you don't know, you don't have the evidence. Do I file? Do I not? A lot of times with these cases, you know, we're having to make a call on whether the accommodation denial was reasonable or not. And I think also too, the issue of accessible housing, again, creates the need for, well, there will be more complaints because there's more accommodation. So I think these discussions are really helpful to make people aware of the civil rights folks with disabilities have been desperately trying to have enforced. And, you know, but I think it's across the board when we look at disability, whether in public life under the ADA or in housing, there's a constant issue of accessibility and folks with disabilities having to essentially wait for their civil rights to be accessed or enforced. And we talk about accessibility in cases I know I've done and others of, you know, even when we do build affordable housing, do we follow the rules and make it accessible, right? Which is another, you know, part to raise awareness to this issue. So I just think it's part of our fair housing bedrock of disability is going to be with us, and we need a massive amount of education, continued technical resources, and then really one day having affordable, having housing stock that's actually accessible, you know, to people will one day, I think, lower this. But right now we're in the midst of a very difficult situation where folks with disabilities are desperate to find housing, and the housing stock we have in California, either naturally affordable or otherwise, is not accessible except for some of these affordable housing structures, the tax credit and others that come online. So I think it's just a constant education because there's so many issues around this, but it is a significant problem and should be elevated. You're on mute, Josh.
I think you're right. Thank you for that answer, Ben, and you're right. There are people who are going to DEFH for their complaint, and my experience is that that's kind of the final stop, that if your fair housing can't take the complaint, it'll go on to DEFH, and a lot of regions that don't have fair housing resources to respond, and perhaps the way San Diego, Los Angeles regions do, end up at DEFH. I can also say that we have a growing number of, one of the reasons this number stay up there is that we have more and more folks like Jessica who are choosing to live independently. We have more folks with physical disabilities who are choosing to live independently. We have more folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities who are choosing to live independently. And in all of these regions across, in both these areas, we have also increasing age. Folks are living longer in both of these areas. And so with that, we have this continual growing need. And instead of getting to where we need to with solutions, what we're seeing is this kind of growing chasm that no matter how much we seem to throw at the problem still seems to grow. And so it's a difficult one to get our hands around, certainly. But I think that we will continue to see discrimination cases, especially with people with disabilities, especially with the private market being so dominant in terms of housing, right? I mean, it's the private market, an unregulated private market. It becomes very difficult to get in there and figure out how we find solutions, when in many cases we don't even know who has what, who owns how much stock, who is the owner of a particular building. It becomes very difficult. And so, you know, I think that speaks to that. Let's see, we have additional questions coming in? If not, I do have a question for our panelists, and that is for Jessica. Jessica, you spoke to some of the challenges that you faced initially at the beginning of this panel. And one of the things I'm hoping you can go into a little bit deeper is, you know, not only are those challenges, you know, difficult to overcome, but maybe you could describe how challenging they are emotionally to deal with and how discouraging it can be to continue on the fight.
They become very emotionally challenging. I mean, like I said, unless you have an area that's directly connected to a housing federation that can connect you with all the housing needs, you're basically at the mercy of a landlord or property owner that, to be quite honest, I got cussed out at one point. And, you know, they get very, very spiteful and start attacking the person directly or people if they have individuals that assist them. So it's multiple individuals that can be attacked at once. I know my rights as an individual, so I had the strength to fight back and, kind of scream at them and argue. And, even when I had roommates, the roommates would bring me in to deal with the landlord. So, but that's not always the case. And it is very, very daunting. And it can be intimidating. I mean, depending on the mood of the landlord or the person in charge, it can even wrongfully, I might add, threaten to evict or threaten your livelihood because they don't want to do what you're asking, whatever the accommodation or whatever the request is.
I imagine it gets to a point where even asking for the accommodation to be made could become fearful once you're told no.
Yes.
And so I think that something that our audience, everyone needs to remember that our natural default settings is ourselves. Everything we view is from our own perspectives. And so it's one of the reasons I wanted to make sure we had Jessica on this panel is to get outside ourselves for a moment and realize, how difficult that struggle can be when you're vulnerable, when you're physically vulnerable, when you're financially vulnerable, to just, getting through a day and knowing something's breaking down in your unit and not having the power to get it fixed. And so that's, again, one of the reasons that I keep underscoring this as kind of a big part of our panel is why we want to make sure that we're building affordable housing at the front end, affordable, accessible housing at the front end. We've once talked about where universal design was something that's real big, but I think that we've gotten sidetracked in many ways. We've been scrambling. We've been facing a crisis, so it's not unusual to end up scrambling and finding solutions. But something like what we're seeing here with the San Diego Housing Federation, the San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing, and bringing people together and creating partnerships, letting us have an opportunity to gather. And I do hope that we have an opportunity to gather in person and network and figure out, how we all can work together and what resources we all do bring to the table to make sure that we can overcome some of these challenges that we're facing as a state. We are apropos, the kind of folks that we are, I often find we're apropos to not congratulate ourselves on progress that we've made. We're on to the next fight right away. And so I do think it's important to realize, that over the last 20 years, we have made a lot of progress. This alliance has made a lot of progress. The fact that we're gathering and having these conversations is progress. The fact that one of our own is now up at the state, talking the talk and talking like we like to hear is progress. And so we're going to keep making that progress and keep going forward. And so I feel that we still have more time left. And so I do want to find out if there are more questions, or I'm going to key up one for my brother and see if he wants to opine on something that we talked about earlier, which is, with accessibility complaints staying up so high for a long period of time, is there something ultimately, that DFH can look into to perhaps, get back into doing some basic education or a campaign, an awareness campaign or something of the sorts? Maybe you're already doing that.
Yeah, we're doing a lot of different things. I mean, one is we do have our Keep California Fair campaign, which does feature persons with a disability. Again, just trying to raise awareness that I think it's on the employment side. But we're trying to do a lot there. We have a new reasonable accommodation manual coming out for housing providers. And I would also add too, we've released COVID-19 housing guidance, a lot of which has to do with discrimination against persons with disabilities. And we will be updating that this month, to include some information about source of income discrimination and emergency rental assistance programs. But I think, look, I just think there's a lot of folks who have disabilities. There's high levels of discrimination because it's kind of this, it's a little different than other civil rights issues where there's a reasonable accommodation and a process. And this is the data nationally. And I don't think we've quite figured out all the issues, right? I mean, you know, we certainly more traditional issues around assistive animals, et cetera, go on. But look, I just think it's a constant struggle, just as like racial discrimination is. It's something that we're always going to have to keep fighting and raising awareness. And with disability, there's just a lot to it. So we'll continue, and I think more events like this. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see that trend line come down for some time until we keep doing this. So, but yeah, I'll wrap it. But yeah, that's my answer.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Branden. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Erin. I really appreciate your time and getting ready for this. I often feel as a moderator, I have it easy, and that my panelists have to do all the work to prepare for this and be ready to answer all these questions. And so I want to thank them for taking the time to do so, and for all the work that they've done for all the years to get us to this point. Again, I want to thank the Regional Alliance for Fair Housing, the San Diego Housing Federation. It's a really great opportunity to be here and talk to you all about this. Have a wonderful rest of your conference, and I'm going to hand it back over to Steve. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Josh. Thank you to all of our panelists, to Branden, to Jessica, to Erin, for sharing your stories. In particular, Jessica, thank you for willing to be so vulnerable with everybody here and honest. I know that's really hard sometimes, but it's imperative people really understand the impact of what we're talking about. This isn't an abstraction. This is very real. I want to thank also our sponsors once again: California Housing and Community Development, Union Bank, Studio E Architects, and the San Diego Housing Commission. I'll also ask each of you to fill out the survey. You'll get a link from Brooklyn. We look forward to your feedback to make sure that we can continue to produce the best possible conference to meet your educational needs and interests. And I'll remind folks that housing is infrastructure. There's a big debate right now about the big infrastructure bill, $3 trillion, I think is the size right now. That's housing is infrastructure, right? And that means a policy that we can affect, all of us, is at all levels. The federal level right now, obviously with this national legislation, to get resources so we can build housing, so we can get more housing vouchers so that people don't have to wait a decade. At the state level, there's likely to be a big housing bond in the 2022 ballot, as much as $6.5 billion that Senator Tony Atkins, Pro Tem Tony Atkins, is putting forward. And locally, we need to look at what we can do to create more local resources to match those other resources. So, you know, housing is key. Housing is a key to a dignified life. We know that, and we appreciate the work of folks here who are advocates for that, and who are advocates for those who are being discriminated against. We've got to do better. We can do better, and I appreciate all of your work. So please do your surveys. We're going to end just a few minutes early here today, but take that time, go out in the sun, enjoy the light, and we will look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. when we begin. We're going to kick off our day 2. With Dr. Zachary Green, who's an amazing professor out of USD, who is going to talk about racial equity and ways that we can act and ways that we can think about it to improve this world. He's an amazing speaker, and I think you'll find him inspiring. So once again, thank you everybody for being here, and we will look forward to seeing you here tomorrow morning. Be well, everyone.